There is a small boat that almost nobody outside Turkey remembers, and it shaped the 20th century more than most of the famous ones ever did. It was an Ottoman mine layer called the Nusret. On a dark night in March of 1915, it slipped quietly into a bay along the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that guards the sea road to Constantinople. For weeks, the British and French fleet had been steaming into that strait by day, shelling the Ottoman forts, and then turning their ships around in one particular stretch of calm water, to steam back out again. They did it so regularly that it had become a habit. The little Nusret crept into that exact stretch of water and laid about 20 mines in a line, right where the great battleships like to turn. Then it went home. No one saw it. No one swept the bay. The mines sat there in the dark and waited. On the 18th of March, the fleet came in to finish the job. This was meant to be the decisive blow. 16 heavy warships sent to smash through the strait, sail up to Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire clean out of the war in a single afternoon. And for a few hours, it looked as though it might actually happen. The forts were being pounded into silence. What the Allies did not know, what they could not have known, was that the Ottoman gunners were running out of shells. Another hour or two of that pressure, and the guns guarding the narrows might have gone quiet for good. Then the French battleship Beauvais pulled out of line to let the ships behind her take a turn at the bombardment. She swung into that quiet patch of water, and she crossed the Nusret's hidden line of mines. There was one huge explosion. She rolled onto her side and went under in about 2 minutes, and she took more than 600 men down with her. The Allied commanders assumed it was a lucky shell, or perhaps a single mine drifting loose. Then the irresistible hit one. Then the ocean. 2 more enormous ships, gone. 3 others were crippled and limping away. In the space of one afternoon, the most powerful fleet in that whole region had been broken apart by a row of cheap mines that one small boat had laid in the dark. The admiral in charge that day, a man named John de Robec, looked at the ruin of his fleet and made the only choice that felt sane to him. He called off the attack. He never sent the ships in again. What makes this hard to look at, a century later, is that he was probably closer to victory in that moment than he would ever be again. He could not see it. All he could see was what he had just lost. The naval attack was finished, and rather than let the whole idea die there, the war found a far worse way to keep it alive. The thing that defeated the Allies at the Dardanelles was not really the Ottoman army, and it was not really those mines. It was a way of thinking, and it is a way of thinking that you already know, because you have done it yourself on a small scale. You have kept reading a boring book because you were already halfway through it. You have sat to the end of a bad film because you had paid for the ticket. You have stayed in a long queue because you had already waited 20 minutes, even as a shorter one opened up beside you. The money is gone. The time is gone. None of it is coming back, no matter what you choose to do next. And still somehow, the simple fact that you have already spent it makes you want to spend more. Economists have a dry name for this. They call it the sunk cost. A sunk cost is anything you have already paid out and cannot get back, whether that is money or hours, or in the case of an army, the lives of your men. The clear-headed thing to do is to ignore it completely when you decide what comes next, because the past cannot be changed and only the future is still yours to shape. But human beings almost never manage that. The more we have poured into something, the harder it becomes to walk away, because walking away means admitting that everything we poured in was wasted. So we pour in more. We throw good money after bad. We throw good years after bad. And on a battlefield, men throw living soldiers after dead ones. There is a crueler twist to it as well. The bigger the loss, the stronger the pull. A small mistake is easy to admit and easy to abandon. But a real disaster, with hundreds or thousands of lives already spent, becomes almost impossible to abandon, because the sheer size of the loss is exactly what makes stopping feel unbearable. To stop is to say out loud that all those men died for nothing. No commander wants to be the one who says that. So instead, he says the opposite. He says they did not die for nothing, they died for something, and we will prove it by sending more. What I want to show you across the next 2 stories is how this single flaw worked its way into 2 of the most intelligent and best resourced military organizations on the planet, and how neither of them, for all their cleverness, could climb back out once they were down inside it. The first stumbled into the trap almost by accident and took months to understand what had happened. The second built the trap on purpose, with cold and careful planning, as a weapon to use against somebody else, and then could not stop himself from walking straight into it. One of these stories ends with a man who managed to get out. The other ends with a man who did not get out in time at all. Let me take you back to where the bad idea was born, because the idea itself was not stupid. That is the part worth understanding. It was clever. By the start of 1915, the war on the Western Front had turned into a horror that nobody had predicted. Two enormous armies sat in trenches facing each other across a few hundred yards of mud, all the way from the sea to the Swiss border, and neither could move the other. Men died by the thousand to take a single field, and then died by the thousand again when the field was taken back the following week. Anyone with a working mind could see that this was madness, and the cleverest minds in London were desperate for a way around it. The man who pushed hardest for a way around it was Winston Churchill, who at the time was First Lord of the Admiralty, the political head of the Royal Navy. He was 40 years old, brilliant, restless, and very sure of himself. And he had what looked like an answer. Instead of battering at the German trenches head-on, why not go around the side, through the back door? Send the fleet to force the Dardanelles, sail up to Constantinople, knock the Ottomans out of the war, open a warm water supply route to a struggling Russia, and rally the smaller nations of the region to the Allied side. Best of all, it could be done with ships alone. No great army, no endless trenches. A clean, clever, economical stroke that would unlock the whole frozen war. You can feel the appeal of it, even now. It is the appeal of the smart shortcut, the move that lets you win without paying the terrible price everyone else is paying. And that appeal is exactly what makes a plan like this so dangerous, because it draws in precisely the kind of intelligent, impatient men who are least willing to give up on a beautiful idea once it starts to go wrong. They are too proud of having spotted the clever path to admit, later, that the clever path was a dead end. So, when the Navy alone could not force the strait, when the Nusrat's mines wrecked the fleet on the 18th of March and de Robeck pulled back, the sensible response would have been to say, well, that was a good idea that did not work, and to stop. But a good idea that did not work is the hardest kind of idea to kill. The plan had powerful men in love with it, and a clever plan with powerful men in love with it does not quietly die when it fails. It survives its own failure, and it asks for more. So the Navy having failed, they sent in the army. This is the first escalation, and you should watch the shape of it, because you will see the same shape again. The original promise had been that no great army would be needed. The whole charm of the plan was that ships could do it cheaply. Now the ships had failed, and instead of accepting that the cheap plan was gone, they reached for an expensive one to rescue it. On the 25th of April, 1915, Allied soldiers waded ashore on the beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula. British and French troops landed at the tip, at a place called Cape Helles. Australian and New Zealand troops, the men who would forever after be known as the Anzacs, came ashore a little further up the coast, at what is now called Anzac Cove. And waiting for them, up on the high ground, was an Ottoman officer who would change everything. His name was Mustafa Kemal, and the world would later know him as Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. On that first day he understood, faster than anyone above him, that whoever held the hills held the whole peninsula. He rushed his men to the heights before the Allies could climb them. There is a famous order he is supposed to have given his soldiers that morning, and whether the exact words are right or not, they catch the man perfectly. He told them he was not ordering them to attack, he was ordering them to die, and that in the time it took them to die, other men would come up behind and take their places. They held the high ground, and within about a week, the entire Allied force was pinned to the beaches, looking up at an enemy they simply could not shift. What followed was 8 months of slow misery. The fighting froze into the same trench deadlock that the whole plan had been designed to escape. The men dug in on narrow strips of dirt, with the sea at their backs and the Ottomans on the slopes above them. In summer, the heat was savage, and the flies came in clouds, crawling over the food and the open wounds and the dead, and dysentery spread through the trenches until half the army was sick. In winter, the storms rolled in, and men froze, and some drowned in their own flooded trenches. The dead lay out in the open ground between the lines because no one could reach them. They had captured a few hundred yards of one of the most wretched pieces of land in the entire war, and they could go no further. And here is the pattern setting hard, like cement. Every time an attack failed, the response was never to ask whether the whole thing had been a mistake. The response was to try harder, push again. Send more men, more shells, one more assault on the same ridge that had eaten the last one. The amount already spent, the men already buried on those slopes, made it feel impossible to simply leave. They had paid too much to leave with nothing. So they stayed, and they paid more. Whenever the question came up of what to do next, the answer was always the same. The answer was always to try harder. That brings us to the second great escalation, in August of 1915. By now the cost was enormous, and the gain was nothing. And so, by the logic of the trap, the plan was not to cut losses, but to gamble even bigger. A fresh army was thrown ashore at Suvla Bay to the north, and the men already on the peninsula were ordered to attack out of their trenches to support it, at places whose names are carved into memory in Australia to this day: Lone Pine, Chunuk Bear, and a narrow neck of ridge, barely wider than a tennis court, called the Neck. What happened at the Neck is the whole disease in miniature, and it is hard to read about even now. Wave after wave of Australian light horsemen were ordered to climb out of their trench and charge across that tiny strip of open ground into Ottoman machine guns that were dug in and waiting only a stone's throw away. The first wave was cut down in seconds. So was the second. By then, every man could see with his own eyes that it was hopeless, that the supporting fire had already stopped and the guns were fully ready and not a single soldier was going to reach the other side. And the next wave was sent anyway, and the one after that. More than 200 young men died in a few minutes on a patch of ground you could throw a stone across. And they died partly because the men before them had already died, and to stop now would have meant admitting that those first deaths had been for nothing. The command could imagine only one direction. It was the direction that had already failed, over and over. It was forward, into more. So what finally broke the spell? This is the most important part of the whole Gallipoli story, and it tells you something true about how these traps actually end. The August offensive failed like all the others, and at last, in October, London did something very simple that they should have done months earlier. They sent a new man out to look at it with fresh eyes. His name was Lieutenant General Sir Charles Munro, and he replaced the commander who had been there through all of it. Munro arrived, walked the lines, studied the situation, and within roughly a single day, he gave his answer: leave, get the army off the peninsula, and stop pouring lives into a position that could never be won. Churchill, who loved the plan and could never forgive the man who ended it, said something bitter about Munro afterward that has followed his name ever since. He sneered that Munro came, saw, and capitulated. It was meant as an insult. But look honestly at what Munro actually did, and it was one of the few clear-sighted acts in the entire campaign. He looked at a hole that smarter and more famous men had been digging for 8 months, and he simply refused to pick up the shovel. Everyone expected the evacuation itself to be a slaughter, to pull an entire army off open beaches while a victorious enemy sat on the hills directly above you, looking down at every move, seemed like an open invitation to be massacred during the retreat. Some officers feared they might lose half their men just getting out. Instead, the evacuation became the single most brilliant and successful operation of the whole campaign. They did it by deception. They thinned the lines out slowly, night after night, so quietly that the Ottomans never noticed the numbers falling. They rigged rifles to fire by themselves, using water dripping into tin cans tied to the triggers. So the trenches still crackled with the odd shot long after the men were gone. And over a few weeks, they took more than 80,000 men off those beaches, with their guns and their animals, and they did it almost without losing a single life. The most competent thing this whole campaign ever did was leave. The retreat was carried out better than any attack ever was. And the reason a clear decision was finally possible was not that Munro was a cleverer soldier than the men before him. It was that Munro was new. He had not been there for the landings. He had not buried those men on those slopes in April, or ordered those charges in August. He owed the dead nothing, because he had not sent them to their deaths. He could weigh the whole position coldly and honestly, and choose to walk away, precisely because he had not paid any of it. If you are getting something out of this, And especially if you have ever watched someone you care about refuse to quit something that was clearly hurting them, do me a small favor and tap the like button. And subscribe if you have not already. It really does help this channel reach more people. And there is a great deal more history of this kind on the way. Right, back to it. Because the Gallipoli story might leave you with a comfortable conclusion. And I want to take that comfort away from you. You might be tempted to think that all of this was simply British amateurism, a muddled plan run by overconfident men who did not really understand modern war, and that a properly professional army would never have fallen for any of it. So let me show you what happened when the most professional, most coldly rational army in the world walked into the very same trap. Except this time nobody stumbled in by accident. This time a brilliant man built the trap on purpose, as a weapon, fully intending for somebody else to be the one who could never escape it. And it still swallowed everything until it had swallowed close to 750,000 men. The man was Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff, which made him in effect the brain running Germany's entire war. He was intelligent, controlled, and unsentimental, the very opposite of a reckless gambler. And toward the end of 1915, he sat down and worked out a piece of military reasoning so cold that people still argue about it 100 years later. I should be straight with you here, because this channel does not pretend the record is tidier than it really is. The famous memorandum, in which he supposedly laid all of this out, often called the Christmas Memorandum, has never actually been found. The Kaiser never seems to have mentioned receiving it. A number of serious historians now suspect that Falkenhayn wrote up this brilliant cold reasoning after the fact, once the battle had already gone wrong, to make his failure look like a clever plan that simply did not pay off. Keep that possibility in your back pocket, because it matters for everything that follows. Here is the reasoning, whenever exactly he arrived at it. Falkenhayn decided that he did not actually need to capture anything. Capturing ground was the old way of thinking, and the old way had produced nothing but slaughter on the Western Front. Instead, he would pick a spot that the French could not bear to lose for reasons of national pride, a place soaked in history and meaning, and he would attack it just hard enough to force the French to defend it to the last man. He did not want to take the city. He wanted the French to pour their army into saving it, into a narrow space where his artillery could grind that army to pieces. The goal was not territory. The goal was killing on an industrial scale, at a favorable rate of exchange. He believed he could trade his men for French men at a rate of 1 of his for 2, perhaps even 5 of theirs. In his own chilling phrase, he meant to bleed France white. And the place he chose was Verdun, an old fortress city on the river Meuse, ringed by forts, with very little real strategic value left to it, but with enormous emotional weight in the French imagination. It stuck out into the German lines in a way that meant he could fire on it from several sides at once. It was, on paper, the perfect trap. He had taken the exact psychological flaw that had destroyed the Allies at Gallipoli, the inability to give up a position once you have bled for it, and he had turned it into a weapon. He was not going to fall into the sunk cost trap. He was going to build one, and push his enemy into it. You can probably already feel the problem with this, the crack running right through the middle of the clever idea. A plan that depends on the enemy being unable to stop paying only works for as long as you yourself are able to stop paying. The whole scheme assumes that you can stay cool while they lose their heads, that you can keep your hands steady on the tap while they bleed. But what if the very same instinct lives in you too? What if, once your own men begin dying in that valley by the tens of thousands, you find that you cannot walk away either? Falkenhayn had designed a machine for trapping other people. The cleverest and most dangerous thing about it was that it could trap him just as easily. And the moment it half worked was the worst thing that could possibly have happened to him. The battle opened on the 21st of February, 1916, with a bombardment unlike almost anything the world had seen up to that point. Something close to 1,000 German guns opened up along a narrow front, and they fired something close to 1 million shells in roughly the first day alone. The Germans called that kind of fire the drum fire, because the individual blasts came so fast that they blurred into one long, continuous, rolling roar you could hear 100 miles away. The forests were stripped to splinters. The ground itself was churned over and over until it stopped looking like earth at all. Within a few days, one of the great forts, Douaumont, fell to a tiny German raiding party almost without a fight, because the French had quietly stripped out most of its guns and men, assuming forts were obsolete. It was a humiliation, and it did exactly what Falkenhayn wanted it to do. It lit a fire under French pride, because France then responded exactly as he had predicted. They poured everything into holding Verdun. A general named Philippe Pétain took charge of the defense, and the rallying cry went up that they shall not pass, a line so powerful it is still quoted in France today. There was only one usable road into the city, a narrow country road, and Pétain turned it into a lifeline. Trucks ran along it day and night in an endless chain, one passing roughly every 14 seconds, hauling fresh men and shells up to the front and the wounded back down. The French called it the Sacred Way. Pétain rotated his divisions through the meat grinder so that no single unit was wiped out all at once, which meant that, over the course of the battle, most of the entire French army passed through Verdun and felt its fire. The trap was closing on schedule. France was bleeding, just as Falkenhayn had drawn it up. The enemy was dying for it, exactly as designed. But here is where the trap turns and bites the hand that set it. To keep the French bleeding, Falkenhayn had to keep the pressure on. And keeping the pressure on meant keeping his own German soldiers attacking into that same churned valley, into the same storm of shellfire that was killing everyone else. The beautiful exchange rate, the 2 of 5 French lives for every German one, never actually arrived. On that ground, with artillery doing the great bulk of the killing on both sides without much caring whose uniform a man wore, the dying came out close to even. For every Frenchman who fell, something close to a German fell with him. And now look at the box Falkenhayn was standing in. His whole reason for fighting at Verdun was attrition, killing far more of them than they killed of him. The moment the killing became roughly equal, the entire logic of the battle collapsed underneath him. The clear-headed move, the de Robeck move, the Monroe move, was to stop. To say, this is not working the way I planned, the numbers are not in my favor, and there is nothing here worth taking anyway, so I will shut it down. But he could not do it. By now Germany had buried tens of thousands of its own men in that valley. To stop would be to admit that all of those Germans had died for a plan that did not work, for a town he never even wanted in the first place. So instead he did the thing every commander in this story does. He kept going. He fed in more reserves, the very reserves he had been carefully saving for a separate blow against the British. And then, in July, the British attacked at the Somme, partly to take the pressure off Verdun. And suddenly Germany was bleeding heavily on 2 fronts at once. So look at where everyone has ended up. The French cannot leave Verdun because their pride and their dead are buried there. And the Germans cannot leave Verdun either because their pride and their dead are now buried right beside them. The man who built the trap to catch his enemy is standing inside it, shoulder to shoulder with the very enemy he meant to catch. And neither of them can climb out, both held in place by the exact same logic, the dead weight of everything already spent. The sunk cost had become a wall around both armies. In the end, the trap was broken the same way the one at Gallipoli was broken, from outside, by replacement. Falkenhayn's grand attrition plan had visibly failed. His masters lost their faith in him, and in the late summer of 1916 they removed him and handed command to other men. By December, after 10 months of it, the French had pushed forward again and taken back almost all of the ground they had lost back in February. The line at the end of the battle sat just about where it had sat at the beginning. For a few miles of poisoned ground handed over and then handed straight back. Close to 750,000 men had been killed or wounded. Nothing of value had been won by anyone. Verdun became, and remains, the single clearest symbol of slaughter without purpose in the entire war. And it happened because the man who started it, and then the men who inherited it, could not bear to be the one to admit that the hole was bottomless. So let me pull these 2 stories together now, because side by side they tell you something that neither one tells you on its own. On the surface, they could hardly be more different. Gallipoli was improvised, a half-worked-out scheme run by a navy and an army that kept tripping over each other. Verdun was engineered, a cold and deliberate piece of strategy designed by one of the sharpest military minds in Europe. One was amateurish, one was ruthlessly professional, and yet they ended in exactly the same place, with intelligent men chained to a losing position by the weight of what they had already thrown into it, unable to stop, sending more after more after more. And in both, notice how the stopping actually came. It did not come from inside. The men who were in the trap, who had paid into it, could not be the ones to end it. At Gallipoli, it took Monroe, a newcomer with no blood of his own in that place, to call it off in a single day. At Verdun, it took the removal of Falkenhayn by his superiors, a decision forced on the battle from above and from outside. In neither case did the person responsible wake up one morning, look honestly at the cost, and choose to walk away. That almost never happens. The trap does not usually release the people inside it. They have to be pulled out or replaced. And once you see that shape clearly, you start to see it almost everywhere. This is not a quirk of the First World War, or of generals, or of 100 years ago. It is one of the most reliable ways that intelligent, capable, well-meaning people destroy themselves and the things they are responsible for. It happens in war, and it happens far away from any war at all, and not only in war. Which leaves the one question that really matters, and it is the one I promised you near the start. Why does being smart not protect you from this? You would think that intelligence would be the cure. You would think the cleverer the commander, the quicker he would spot the trap and step neatly out of it. The reverse is closer to the truth. Intelligence tends to make this particular trap worse, not better. And there are 4 reasons for that, and they are worth knowing, because they apply to you and to me just as squarely as they applied to Falkenhayn. The first reason is that intelligence is, more than anything else, a tool for building arguments. A sharp mind is a machine for generating reasons. And when you are emotionally committed to not quitting, that machine does not sit there neutrally weighing the evidence. It goes to work building the best possible case for carrying on. Because carrying on is the answer you already want. A clever commander can always construct a sophisticated, convincing argument for why one more push will finally break through, why the situation is about to turn, why the next attack will be the different one. A less clever man might simply look at the heap of bodies and feel, in a dull and wordless way, that this is wrong and we should stop. The clever man can talk himself straight out of that feeling. His great gift becomes the instrument of his own deception. The second reason is about pride, and it cuts deep. The higher a man has risen on the strength of his own judgment, the more of himself is invested in that judgment being right. For someone like Falkenhayn, quitting Verdun would not have meant only losing a battle. It would have meant admitting that his celebrated strategic brilliance had produced a catastrophe. The cleverer you are, and the more your whole identity is built on being the clever one, the more unbearable it becomes to stand up and say, "I was wrong, and people died because I was wrong." So the smart man keeps going, not because the plan is working, but because stopping would shatter the story he tells himself about who he is. The third reason is the strangest and the saddest. A sharper mind sees the cost more clearly, not less. A dull commander might lose track of the dead, let them blur into a number on a page. But an intelligent, sensitive commander truly understands what each of those lives was worth, counts them, feels the weight of every single one. And rather than freeing him, that clarity chains him tighter, because now he feels he owes them. He cannot let them have died for nothing. The more vividly he grasps the scale of what has already been spent, the more impossible it becomes for him to call it all a waste. His clear sight, the very thing that should set him free, becomes the heaviest link in the chain. And the fourth reason follows from all the others, and it is the practical one, the one you can actually use. Since the person inside the trap almost cannot escape it by thinking harder, because his thinking is the very thing that has been compromised, the clear judgment has to come from somewhere else entirely. It has to come from outside. It has to come from someone who is not emotionally invested, who did not make the original decision, who has no pride riding on the outcome, and no debt of their own to answer for. The clear-eyed call to stop, in nearly every case, has to come from someone who never paid in. And let me say plainly that this is not really a story about old wars at all. I have told it through Gallipoli and Verdun, because the stakes there were life and death, and the pattern shows up in sharp relief, but the pattern itself is sitting in your own life right now, dressed in much quieter clothes. It is the failing business that keeps pouring money into a product nobody wants, because the founders cannot face the years they have already lost. It is the person who stays a decade too long in a relationship or a job that stopped being right years ago, because leaving would mean admitting the last decade was a mistake. It is the gambler who cannot leave the table while he is down, because leaving makes the losses real and final. It is every one of us, on an ordinary Tuesday, refusing to abandon something that is plainly not working, because we have already paid so much to be standing here. And the hardest truth in all of it is the one we keep circling back to. Being intelligent does not save you. If anything, it equips you to build a finer, stronger, more reasonable-looking cage, and then to lock yourself inside it with a clear conscience. Falkenhayn was not a fool. Churchill was not a fool. The officers who sent wave after wave across the neck were not fools. These were some of the most capable men of their age, and their capability was not their defense against the trap. Their cleverness was exactly what stopped them from getting out. Both of these places are quiet now. If you walk the slopes above Anzac Cove today, it is a still and beautiful stretch of coast, with the sea glittering far below and the wind moving through the scrub, and it is very hard to picture the men who once clung to those gullies in the heat and the flies. The Turks and the Australians and the New Zealanders who fought there came, in time, to honor one another, and there are words carved at that site, attributed to Ataturk himself, telling the grieving mothers of the fallen enemy that their sons now lie in peace in friendly soil. It is one of the few truly gentle things to come out of any of this. And the ground at Verdun has never fully healed, not even after 100 years. There are whole zones there where the soil is still so full of shell fragments and old poison and bone that nothing is allowed to be built and almost nothing will properly grow. At the heart of it stands a great stone building called the ossuary, and inside it are heaped the bones of more than 100,000 men who were blown apart so completely that no one could ever say who they were. French and German mixed together in the same vaults, because in the end, the shellfire never cared which side a man had been clever enough to choose. So if you take one thing away from these two stories, let it be this. When you find yourself fighting to justify a cost you have already paid, stop and notice that this is what you are doing. Ask yourself the one question that almost no one in either of these stories managed to ask in time. Not how much have I already put in, but, starting from right now, knowing only what I know today, is this still worth doing? And if you cannot trust your own answer because you are too close to it and have paid in too much, then go and find your Monroe. Find the person who has no stake in your pride. Let them tell you the truth, and then have the courage to actually listen. If this story gave you something, the best thing you can do for me is press that like button and subscribe to the channel, because there is a great deal more of this coming, and your being here is what makes it possible to keep making it. And if you are not quite finished yet, I have not left you with nowhere to go. There is another video waiting for you on your screen right now, picked out to follow on from this one. Whenever you are ready, go ahead and click it. Go on. I will see you over there.